My name is Robert Gregory, and I'm the Public Affairs Director with the Australian Jewish Association. AJA takes the lessons of the Holocaust seriously and is committed to remembrance, education, and hearing survivor stories. This year, in honor of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, we're speaking to survivor Suzi Smeed. Suzi was born in Budapest, Hungary, and was a small child in the Holocaust. She managed to survive with a remarkable story and immigrated to Australia. Suzi has volunteered with Courage to Care for 5 years, telling her story. And last year, the Israeli embassy flew Suzi to Canberra to hear from her directly. Suzi's about to launch a book, which we will hear more about shortly. She's also a supporter of the AJA, and we are honoured to speak to her. Thank you so much for joining the Australian Jewish Association today, Suzi.
Thank you, Robert. And it's also an honour to speak with the AJA, which I'm a great fan of.
Thank you. Well, can you start by telling us a bit about the story of your family's childhood in Hungary and your experience during the Holocaust?
Well, I was born in 1942 in Budapest, before the Holocaust really took hold in Hungary. But then in 1944, Eichmann marched into Hungary and we were rounded up. My father was in a labour camp by this stage. My mother and I went down to a little town called Papa, where her parents lived, to bring them back into hiding into Budapest. And of course, we were too late. We were rounded up. There was a ghetto built very quickly, and in four blocks, they rounded up 3,500 Jews in that little tiny space. And very, very fortunately for my mother and I, we were smuggled out of the ghetto by a friend, a lay priest. He really wanted to bring out my grandparents as well, but the guards wouldn't let 4 of us out. And can you imagine my mother? She didn't want to leave her parents behind, and we nearly didn't go. But her parents insisted that she was a young mother with a young child and that she must live. And so we were smuggled out of the ghetto and driven up to Budapest. Within a few weeks, the entire ghetto, the 3,500 Jews, were packed onto cattle trucks on a 3-day journey to Auschwitz. Most of them went to the gas chambers, and that included my grandparents. We went into hiding for a while, and Dad escaped from the labour camp. And then the Hungarian Arrow Cross started rampaging through Budapest, and we had to hide again. And we went back into our apartment. My parents went into the ceiling space. This was in the November, as the Russians were approaching Budapest. And they were very concerned that I was only 2 years old and I couldn't survive the cold, and they didn't know how long they'd have to hide there. And they asked our maids, who were Christians, who were very good to us, and there were some very good people that helped the Jews. And they asked the maids to take me to the countryside with their relatives to hide me. And when the Russians arrived and Budapest was liberated, my parents came out of the ceiling space, and they'd been there for about 6 weeks in the freezing cold with almost no food. And the maids finally came back, and they didn't have me and they were very apologetic, and they said they couldn't take me to where they hoped to take me. And they left me in a little orphanage in a town called Miskolc towards the Eastern Front. And so can you imagine my parents? They set out on foot in the freezing cold in February to try and locate me. And they were told by a woman on a train when Mother was crying, and the woman said to her, "What are you Jews doing here?" All the Jews had gone. And my mother said, "We're trying to locate my little red-headed Suzi, who was left in an orphanage." And it was almost like a miracle. The lady said, "I come from there. I know that orphanage. The orphanage was bombed. The children were dispersed. And did your little red-headed Suzi have a jumper with Zhuzhikov?" embroidered in the front. And can you remember my mother? She said, yes, that's how I sent her away. And she said, I know someone in my village that took in a little red-headed child like that. Wasn't quite that easy to find me, because apparently I had been passed around to 7 different families. And my parents finally located me at the end of a village with a peasant lady. I was hidden in a barn, and she kept me in a trough where the animal feed was. And when my parents found me, from the story they tell, I almost no hair, and I was covered in sores, and I was pretty grubby, still had the jumper on, so we recognised each other. So that's how our family survived the Holocaust. And my parents looked after the old lady that kept me at the end of the war. And then in 1948, we escaped from the Russians in the communists in a Russian mail truck under sacks of mail, because Dad was a marked man because he was a businessman. And so we had to escape from the communists. And so in 1949, we fortunately came to Australia. And my father had this grand sum of £9 in his pocket. And that's how we started life out in Australia, this wonderful country.
It's truly a miraculous story. So
I had 3 very lucky escapes, Robin. I'll expand the story more when I tell it at schools, but that's the basis of it. But we lost nearly all our other relatives, all went to Auschwitz. And just as a little addendum to this, and many people don't realise, the Hungarian Holocaust was described by Winston Churchill as the greatest crime in all of humanity, in all of history. In 56 days, 437,000 Hungarian Jews were shipped to Auschwitz, and the majority to the gas chambers.
Yeah, it's often overlooked part of the Holocaust, what happened in Hungary, and that it was so close to the end of the war. So.
Absolutely, yes. And then when the Arrow Cross took over, when the Nazis were retreating, the Hungarian Arrow Cross took over from November till the Russians arrived, and they rampaged through Budapest. And this is where my parents were hiding in the ceiling space. They rounded up 20,000 men, women, and children, took them down to the side of the Danube. Some they tied together, made them take their shoes off, and shot them. And there's a very moving memorial on the site there of 30,000, I think. 60,000, 6,000, sorry. 60 sets of bronze shoes to commemorate that absolutely horrific event there on the side of the Danube.
Truly is terrible, and I also have a personal connection. As I mentioned to you, my father's born in Hungary. He came as a small child here, and my grandmother was in Auschwitz, and
right.
So yeah, definitely very personal story, the Hungarian Holocaust. Brings me to my second question, which is about Holocaust education. And as you know, AJ has been a very vocal advocate of Holocaust education in schools. So we just wanted to get what your thoughts are about the state of Holocaust education, the importance of Holocaust education in Australia today.
Well, I think history is not taught very much at all in Australia, let alone the Holocaust, which I found horrifying. I'm associated with a group called Courage to Care up here in Queensland, and I know it started in Sydney, and it's a wonderful program where the teachers that are interested in the Holocaust and want to teach the children about history invite us in to talk about the Holocaust. And it's a program in 3 parts, where the first part they're taught about the Holocaust. Then you have a survivor like myself who tells their story. And then the students are invited to talk about what they got out of the story. And the thing I find absolutely wonderful, that the feedback we've had from the pupils is very rewarding, and they pass it on to their siblings quite often, and we'll go back to the schools and they've heard about it, and we've got some wonderful feedback from them. And I just really wish that more schools would invite us in to come and talk about the Holocaust. So it's so important that this horrendous part of history is never forgotten. And there are so many good books and films that they could learn. But being invited into the schools, I think, is the best way that we can touch children, and so they're aware of what has happened in the past.
Yeah, I've heard very good feedback about from other survivors about speaking in schools and from children hearing that. So I agree. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
But one of the less positive things is that anti-Semitism has been on the rise worldwide. Australia is no exception. Do you have any thoughts on the current anti-Semitism situation? What might be behind it? What are some potential solutions to help with it?
Well, I wish I could, Robert, but I find it really horrifying. Every day, almost every day, you pick up the paper and you see people that are attacked in the streets. You see swastikas hanging from windows. There seems to be such a concerted effort to attack the Jews, and I just don't know how we can fight this. It's just, I was just reading in the paper in New York, for instance, the incidence has gone up like 35%. A lot of the Jews are too frightened to walk out in the street. The universities are very anti-Semitic. They seem to promote this agenda very much. I know synagogues have been burnt down. Even here in Australia, a synagogue I was involved in Bondi many years ago was burnt down. The schools all have to have guards on them. I just do not understand the people's motive when the Jews have given so much to humanity in every field of endeavour, and yet we're being targeted all the time. I feel that very, very deeply, and it's very scary.
It is, and yeah, it's an age-old problem that a lot of people thought had gotten better, but it doesn't seem to.
Yes, no, it seems to have escalated. It's suddenly become a left-wing, very fashionable thing. I don't understand it.
It does seem, yeah, to be a growing concern on the left.
Yes, very much so.
It leads me to my next question, which is that recently there's been quite a few examples in Australia of prominent figures on the left. For example, the Victorian Premier Dan Andrews weaponising the Nazi slur and using it to attack their political opponents. AJA President Dr. Adler has been interviewed on this topic, and he also wrote a piece recently in the Spectator magazine about it. So what do you think about... Sorry?
Go on, sorry.
Yeah, so what do you think about this phenomenon of tarring one's political opponents, usually on the right wing, with the Nazi slur?
Well, I've just been so disgusted with what has happened in politics in Australia. I mean, the first thing was when the Labor Party came in and gave $20 million to UNRWA, which is the Hamas terrorist group, and I actually even wrote to our Attorney General, who is a Jew who should hang his head in shame. It was just disgusting. And it's become such a fashionable thing to say you're a Nazi when you're attacking people. I mean, these women that were protecting women's rights, and they were attacked as Nazis. When you look at Israel is the only democratic country in the Middle East and where women have all the freedom, and yet they're called us Nazis. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense at all. And then the Writers' Festival in Adelaide, we had two absolutely the most disgusting comments made about Jews, that they should be wiped off the face of the earth, by two very pro-Palestinian speakers. And this was a festival funded by Australian taxpayers. They should be ashamed to do this.
Yeah, 100%. The Adelaide Festival was shocking. I mean, we wrote to the Premier and asked him to intervene, the Labor Premier in South Australia, and he didn't, and taxpayer money funded it.
That's right. And the comments that were made were just horrendous. I can't I can't speak them. They were so horrible.
It really was shocking.
Yeah.
Suzi, you've written a book. I wanted to ask you, first of all, how can people buy it? And are there any public events people can attend?
Well, at the moment, I haven't yet. The book is being launched in Brisbane on the 27th of April, and it's through a publishing house called Connor Court. And I actually have not seen the book myself yet, but Robert, there's, I don't know if you can see.
Yeah, we can see that.
Can you? No, you can't see it.
We saw The Courage to Care with them.
Yes, The Courage to Care. And you can buy it through Connor Court, and will be out at the end of the month. In Brisbane, we're having the launch at City Hall, and then where I live up in Noosa, we're having another launch, and then I hope to come down to Sydney later in the year and do a speaking tour down in Sydney with the book, and then in Melbourne. I think the book is particularly interesting because the gentleman that helped write it is a very well-known editor, and he headed up numerous newspapers, both in England and America and in Australia. And he's a great researcher, and he's done an amazing research on the Hungarian Jews right from day one, which goes right through the centuries, and then an enormous history of the Hungarian Holocaust, quite apart from my family story. And then it goes through my life up till today. So it's not the normal Holocaust story. There's a lot of history in the book, which is beautifully written.
Well, yeah, definitely be sure to get a copy. And did you mention there was going to be a special guest at the launch? Was that in Queensland?
Yes, I've got Alan Jones coming. He's a very good friend of ours, so
Oh,
I feel very honoured that he's going to come up from Sydney to Brisbane to be the MC at my launch. And I've got Ian Callahan, the retired High Court judge, coming. So some very wonderful people have backed my book, and so it's very exciting. I never thought in my 80th year that I'd be writing a book and I'd be talking about my life.
Well, it's very special, and AJ will be happy to help you with anything, if promoting any events or anything.
Thank you. That will be wonderful. When I get round to coming to Sydney, I'll certainly let you know.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Suzi. It's been a real honour. Thank you for sharing your story, and definitely will be getting your book. So, wishing you many years of health and to keep telling your story. It's really important.
Yes, well, I've got to say, I get a real pleasure out of speaking to school children that are so receptive, and I wish more schools would join in the program. And I'll just say that from Israel, which I am such a great supporter of. It's the most wonderful country, and they've done some amazing things. And
It has the power.
And has the power, and never again, which is the Israeli motto, never again.
Very, very important message.